14 of the world's top interpreters sat in a room on the 49th floor. None of them could keep up. A $300 million deal was falling apart, and the CEO was seconds from walking out. Then a janitor, a black single father who mopped these halls on the night shift, pushed through the side door and said 5 words, "Ma'am, give me 30 seconds." What happened next made every interpreter in that room go quiet. The hallway lights on the 47th floor buzzed the same pale yellow they always did after midnight. Noah Monroe pushed his mop cart past the row of executive offices, the rubber wheels leaving no sound on the marble. He was 34 years old, 6'1", and to every security camera in the building, he was nobody, just another janitor on the night shift at Hawthorne Global. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Mrs. Gaines 3 floors below in apartment 4C. She's asleep on the couch. Took 2 stories tonight. Noah smiled. 2 stories meant Amara had fought bedtime hard. He finished the East Wing by 1:15, locked his cart in the utility closet, and caught the last bus home. The apartment was small, a kitchen that doubled as a living room, 1 bedroom he gave to Amara, and a pull-out couch where he slept. Mrs. Gaines had left the door unlocked. He found his daughter curled on the sofa, a picture book still open across her chest. He lifted her carefully. She stirred against his shoulder, eyes half open. "Daddy?" "Yeah, baby. Let's get you to bed." She let him carry her to the bedroom, but as he pulled the blanket up, her voice came small and clear in the dark. "Daddy, why did Dylan at school say janitor like it's a bad thing?" Noah's hand stayed on the blanket. He could feel the shape of the question underneath it, not just a 6-year-old repeating a word, but the first crack in the wall he had been trying to build between his daughter and the world's opinion of him. "Because he doesn't know what it means yet," Noah said. "It means the person who keeps everything standing." Amara accepted this the way children accept things that sound true enough. She closed her eyes. Within a minute, her breathing was slow and even. Noah walked back to the kitchen and sat at the small table by the window. This was his hour. The apartment was quiet, the street below finally still, and for the next 90 minutes before exhaustion pulled him under the table, became something else entirely. He opened a notebook, cloth-covered edges worn soft, and turned to the page he had been working on for the past week. Swiss-German verb conjugations written in his own hand, cross-referenced with standard High German in the margin. On the shelf behind him, a water-damaged French grammar he had bought for $2 at a thrift store in Baton Rouge, a Spanish phrasebook missing its cover, an Arabic primer held together with rubber bands. Beside them, a portable radio tuned most nights to a Cairo AM station that came through with enough static to make listening an act of faith. 9 languages. He had never sat in a university classroom for any of them. The French came from 3 years washing dishes in a restaurant in New Orleans where the head chef refused to speak English in his kitchen. The Spanish from construction crews in Texas. The German from a shipping foreman in Baltimore who played Bundesliga matches on a cracked tablet during lunch breaks. The same foreman whose Swiss-born mother called on weekends and spoke Romansh, a language so rare Noah could not find a textbook for it. So he sat in the break room and listened until the sounds became words and the words became meaning. The Italian from an old woman in his foster home who spoke only Milanese dialect and needed anyone to understand her. The Japanese from a library audiobook program he discovered at 19. The Arabic from a dock worker in Norfolk named David, who taught him to say thank you in Cairo dialect, and told him, "Language is the one thing nobody can take from you, Noah." The Russian and Mandarin came later from late nights, exactly like this one radio station's, borrowed books, free language apps, used until the daily limits expired. He had no certificate, no diploma, no transcript. He had something that could not fit on a resume, an ear that could hear what people meant underneath what they said, trained not in a classroom but in kitchens and construction sites and shelters where understanding the person next to you was not a skill, it was survival. Nobody at Hawthorne Global knew any of this. To them, Noah Monroe was the night janitor who emptied the trash on the executive floors and left before the sun came up. Vivian Hart arrived at Hawthorne's headquarters at 6:45 every morning, 45 minutes before anyone on her leadership team. Her office on the 49th floor had a view of the entire downtown skyline, and she never looked at it. Views were for people who needed reminders of what they were working toward. Vivian did not need reminders. She needed results. At 52, she was the first woman to hold the CEO title at Hawthorne Global in its 90-year history. She had earned it by being twice as prepared, half as emotional, and willing to outlast every man who assumed she would eventually step aside. This morning, the results she needed were specific: a $300 million international acquisition of Cronin Consortium's European logistics network. If closed, it would make Hawthorne Global a top 5 player on 2 continents. If botched, it would cost her the board's confidence and her chair. She told her assistant one thing before the delegation arrived: everything has to be flawless. No surprises. Victor Cronin walked into the 49th floor conference room at 9 sharp, flanked by 6 advisors, 3 lawyers, and a reputation that preceded him by a decade. He was 58, Austrian by birth, Russian by heritage, American by strategy. In the world of international mergers and acquisitions, people who knew him called him many things, but the name that stuck in boardrooms across 3 continents was quiet and accurate: the polyglot shark. Victor spoke 6 languages fluently. He did not use them to communicate. He used them to control. His method was simple and devastatingly effective: switch dialects, mid-sentence embed binding legal terminology inside casual pleasantries, bury penalty clauses in the grammar of languages his opponent's interpreters could not fully follow. By the time the other side realized what had been said, they had already nodded. He did not raise his voice. He did not pound tables. He smiled, spoke softly, and let language do the cutting. Today, he intended to walk out of this room with Hawthorne locked into a contract that would surrender their Western European market access for 7 years. And he intended for Vivian Hart to sign it without ever knowing that was what she had agreed to. The conference room held 32 people. 2 long rows faced each other across a glass table polished to a mirror finish. Hawthorne's team on one side, Cronin's on the other. 14 interpreters sourced from the most prestigious translation firms in New York, London, and Geneva were positioned along the walls, each assigned to a specific language pair. It took 11 minutes for the system to fail. Victor Cronin opened in formal French, complimenting Vivian on Hawthorne's quarterly performance. Mid-sentence, he shifted to a rare Swiss-German dialect to address his deputy, embedding a clause about regional exclusivity into what sounded like an aside about scheduling. Before the French interpreter could flag the switch, Cronin's legal counsel began speaking rapid Northern Spanish to a colleague, layering in terminology that the Spanish interpreter translated as regional cooperation, when the actual meaning was closer to market exclusion. The Milanese Italian came next, folded into a toast. Then formal Japanese directed at a silent partner from Tokyo, promising terms that contradicted the English version on the table. Then Egyptian dialect Arabic wrapped around a blessing that contained a penalty clause worth tens of millions. The interpreters scrambled. 2 asked for repetitions. 1 stopped translating mid-sentence, unsure which version was correct. Another provided a translation that directly contradicted the interpreter beside her. The room's professional calm began to crack. Vivian watched it happen. She could see her interpreters failing not from incompetence, but because they had been out-engineered. Cronin had not come to negotiate. He had come to perform a linguistic siege, and her defenses were falling one by one. She was reaching for the button to call a recess when she caught Victor Cronin's expression across the table. He was watching her like a chess player studying an opponent who has already reached for a trapped piece. She was about to end the meeting. Outside the conference room's side door, Noah Monroe was on his hands and knees scrubbing a stain from the baseboard. 7 hours of sleep and a bus ride back, He had picked up overtime because Amara's dental insurance was due on the 15th, and he was $300 short. The side door was propped open an inch for ventilation, and through that inch, every word spoken inside the conference room reached him with perfect clarity. He understood all of it: the French, the Swiss German, the Northern Spanish, the Milanese Italian, the formal Japanese, the Egyptian Arabic. The Russian side conversation about Cronin's real floor price, 40% lower than the number on the table. The Mandarin exchange about a parallel deal that reduced Hawthorne to a pawn. And the Romansh, the rare Swiss minority language that Cronin used for the most dangerous clause of all, a binding European market restriction that would cost Hawthorne close to $100 million over 7 years. Noah set down his rag. His hands were trembling. He knew what he was hearing. He knew what Hawthorne was about to sign, and he knew that if he stood up, walked through that door, and opened his mouth, every person in that room would see exactly one thing: a black janitor who had lost his mind. He thought about Amara, about the rent due in 19 days, about the health insurance, about every logical reason to stay on his knees and keep scrubbing. Then he thought about her question. Why did Dylan say janitor like it's a bad thing? Because he doesn't know what it means yet. It means the person who keeps everything standing. If he stayed silent, now that answer would become a lie. Noah stood up. He set the cleaning bottle on the floor. He pushed the side door open with one hand and walked into a room full of people who controlled more money in a single morning than he would see in a lifetime. Every head turned. 32 people stared at the man in the blue janitor's uniform and rubber-soled shoes standing in the doorway of a $300 million negotiation. Noah looked directly at Vivian Hart. "Ma'am, give me 30 seconds." The room did not process what it was seeing. A man in a blue janitor's uniform, rubber-soled shoes, still damp from the hallway floor, standing inside a conference room where the cheapest suit cost more than his monthly rent. Vivian's assistant shot to her feet. "Security now!" A member of Hawthorne's leadership team leaned toward the colleague beside him, his whisper cutting across the silence. "This is a disaster. Get him out before Cronin's people start recording." 2 security guards were already moving toward the door. One of them reached for his radio. But it was Victor Cronin who spoke next. He turned to his deputy across the glass table and said in Swiss-German dialect, the same dialect he had been using all morning to hide strategy from Hawthorne's interpreters, a sentence delivered with the calm amusement of a man watching a house burn from across the street. Not one of the 14 interpreters translated it. None of them could. Noah could. He turned to face Victor Cronin directly and said in English, his voice steady and unhurried, "Mr. Cronin just told his deputy, and I'm translating exactly. Look at this. They can't even control their cleaning staff. This deal is easier than I thought." The words landed like a crack in glass. Every interpreter in the room stiffened. Victor Cronin's deputy set down his pen. The security guards stopped walking. Victor himself did something he had not done once during the entire negotiation. His smile disappeared. For 3 full seconds, no one in the room moved. Then Vivian Hart, who had built a career on never revealing surprise, looked at the janitor standing 6 feet from the door and spoke. "You have your 30 seconds." Noah did not perform. He did not raise his voice or gesture with his hands or scan the room for validation. He stood with his feet apart, his hands at his sides, and he spoke as a man speaks when the thing he is saying matters more than the uniform he is saying it in. The security guards looked at Vivian. She held up one hand without turning her head. They stopped. He began in French. Not conversational French, not textbook French, the precise contractual French that Cronin's team had used in their opening. He repeated the first clause they had presented to Vivian, the one the French interpreter had translated as a standard cooperation agreement, and then he broke it open. The phrasing Cronin had used contained a deliberate ambiguity, a word that in formal contract language meant partnership, but in the specific legal context of European Union trade regulation meant conditional access. It was the difference between Hawthorne entering the European market as an equal and entering it on a leash. He shifted to Swiss German without breaking stride. Not standard High German, the same rare Alemannic dialect Victor Cronin had been using all morning to speak freely with his team. Noah translated not just the insult from a moment ago, but 3 other exchanges that had happened earlier in the session. In one of them, Victor had told his deputy to let Hawthorne's interpreters argue among themselves because the confusion was buying time. In another, he had confirmed to his legal counsel that the real strategy was to close before lunch, while Vivian was still reacting instead of reading. Northern Spanish came next. Noah addressed the clause that Cronin's lawyer had discussed with a colleague from Madrid, the one the Spanish interpreter had rendered as regional cooperation framework. Noah translated the actual phrase, regional exclusion protocol. He explained what it meant in practice. Hawthorne would be contractually barred from independent operations in 4 Western European countries for the duration of the agreement. Then Milanese Italian. The toast that Cronin's financial officer had offered midway through the session, the one that had drawn polite smiles from Hawthorne's team, contained terminology specific to Milanese banking contracts. Embedded in the phrasing of a wish for mutual prosperity was a clawback provision that would let Cronin reclaim shared assets under conditions that Hawthorne's legal team had never been shown. He moved to formal Japanese, addressing the terms that Cronin had offered to the silent partner seated at the far end of the table. Noah laid them beside the English terms in Hawthorne's draft. They did not match. The Japanese version promised exclusivity. The English version promised shared access. Cronin was selling the same territory to 2 buyers. Egyptian dialect Arabic followed. The blessing that had closed one of Victor's longer speeches, the one that every interpreter had treated as ceremonial language, was not ceremonial. Noah translated it line by line. Inside the traditional phrasing, Cronin had embedded a penalty clause if Hawthorne attempted to renegotiate any terms within the first 36 months. They would owe a fee equal to 12% of the total contract value. Then Russian. Noah had heard Victor exchange 4 sentences in Russian with his chief financial officer during what appeared to be a sidebar about scheduling. It was not about scheduling. Victor had confirmed that Cronin's actual floor price for the logistics network was 40% below the number currently on the table. They were prepared to accept far less. They simply never expected to be asked. Mandarin was 8th. A brief exchange between Cronin's deputy and an advisor who had said nothing in English all morning. Noah translated the substance. Cronin was simultaneously negotiating a parallel acquisition with a firm based in Shanghai. The terms of that deal would reduce Hawthorne's role in the European network from partner to subcontractor within 18 months. Hawthorne was not buying an asset. They were buying the appearance of one. And then, the 9th language. Romansch, Grischen, a minority language spoken by fewer than 60,000 people in the Swiss canton of Graubünden. It was the language Victor Cronin had chosen for the single most dangerous clause in the entire negotiation, a binding restriction that would lock Hawthorne out of independent operations in Western Europe for 7 years, at a cost the company would not survive cleanly. Noah translated every word. He did not miss one. 30 seconds had become 4 minutes. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody tried. 2 of the 14 interpreters had quietly closed their notebooks. One had removed her earpiece. When he finished, the conference room was not the same room it had been 4 minutes ago. Not louder, not quiet or different in the way a room changes when every person inside it has to rearrange what they thought they knew. Victor Cronin sat motionless across the table. He was no longer looking at Vivian Hart. He was looking at Noah Monroe, not at a janitor, but at a man who had just revealed himself as the only real opponent in the room. Vivian Hart had not spoken a word since giving Noah his 30 seconds. She studied him with the same precision she gave a balance sheet. No emotion, just the slow recognition that what she was looking at changed everything. The recess was called at 11:15. Cronin's delegation was escorted to a holding suite on the 48th floor. Hawthorne's leadership team gathered in the internal boardroom adjacent to Vivian's office. The door had barely closed before the room erupted. Gerald Foster Hawthorne's chief operating officer spoke first. He was standing, which he did when he wanted the room to understand that what he was about to say was not a suggestion. This is a catastrophe waiting to happen. A janitor just interrupted a $300 million negotiation in front of our biggest counterparty. If the press finds out that our CEO was rescued by a cleaning staff member, we are done. Diane Pratt, the head of communications, was already drafting scenarios on her tablet. If Cronin leaks this, and they will, we lose control of the narrative completely. Hawthorne, CEO saved by janitor, is not a headline we survive. He violated security protocol, added Ray Collins from legal, his voice flat and precise. He entered a restricted room without clearance. There is no gray area. We terminate or we set a precedent that any employee in this building can walk into a board-level meeting. Vivian sat at the head of the table and said nothing. She was not processing emotion. She was processing strategy, and strategy required her to hear every argument against Noah before she decided what to do with them. The decision came in under 20 minutes, and it was unanimous among the leadership team. Noah Monroe was suspended immediately effective at the close of the recess. His access badge was to be deactivated. Security would escort him from the building. Vivian did not override them. Not yet. She watched Noah leave, flanked by 2 guards, still in his blue uniform, still carrying himself with the same quiet composure he had held in the conference room, and she made no expression at all. Downstairs on the 48th floor, Victor Cronin was making a different calculation. He had not spoken since the recess was called. His deputy sat across from him, waiting. "Find out everything about that man," Victor said. "Name, address, employment history. Everything." His deputy frowned. "For what purpose?" Victor leaned back in his chair. "A person who speaks 9 languages, including Romansh, is not mopping floors by choice. He is mopping floors because no one has ever looked at him long enough to see what he is. If Hawthorne is too stupid to keep him, we will not make the same mistake." The apartment was dark when Noah turned his key. He had taken the bus home in the middle of the afternoon, something he had never done, because in the middle of the afternoon he was supposed to be sleeping before his next shift. There would be no next shift. The suspension letter was in his back pocket. His access badge, the one he swiped every night at the service entrance, had been deactivated while he stood in the lobby. The guard who did it would not look him in the eye. Amara was still at school. The apartment felt larger when it was empty, which only made it feel more fragile. He sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the letter. The language was clean and corporate. Suspended pending review. No timeline. No appeal process mentioned. He set the letter down next to his notebook, the same cloth-covered notebook where he had been conjugating Swiss-German verbs the night before. He stared at the 2 documents side by side, the language that had just cost him his job, and the language he had spent years learning in the quiet hours when no one was watching. He thought about the numbers. Rent in 19 days. Amara's dental insurance on the 15th still $300 short, and now there would be no overtime check to close the gap. The savings account had enough to cover 1 month, maybe 6 weeks if he cut everything that could be cut. After that, he did not know. He had walked into that room knowing this could happen. He had done it anyway. And sitting alone in the kitchen where he studied every night, he could not tell whether that made him brave or reckless, or simply a man who had confused what was right with what he could afford. He picked up Amara from school at 3:15, same as always. She asked why he was there instead of Mrs. Gaines. He told her he got off work early. She accepted this with the kind of trust that has not yet learned to ask follow-up questions. They walked home hand in hand, and Noah carried a weight in his chest that he could not explain to a 6-year-old, so he carried it alone. At Hawthorne's headquarters, the pressure landed on Vivian from a different direction. Daniel Webb, the vice chairman of the board and Vivian's most reliable political ally for 8 years, called her directly. His voice was measured, which meant he was angry. Vivian, I supported you through the restructuring. I backed you on the Southeast Asia expansion when half the board wanted your head. But if you try to bring that janitor back into this process, I will consider it a judgment failure. And I will not be alone. The implication was precise. If Vivian moved to reinstate Noah, she would lose Daniel. And losing Daniel meant losing the board votes that had kept her in her chair through every crisis of the last 8 years. That same evening, a plain envelope arrived at Noah's apartment. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the Cronin Consortium letterhead, an invitation to a private meeting with Victor Cronin, and a salary figure written at the bottom of the page. The number was 10 times what Noah earned mopping floors. He held the paper under the kitchen light and read it twice. It was enough to pay off every medical bill. Enough to move Amara out of the apartment with the leaking ceiling. Enough to stop counting days until the next paycheck. He set it on the table next to the suspension letter and the notebook. 3 pieces of paper. One that said he was worthless. One that said he was worth a fortune. And one the notebook that had never tried to tell him what he was worth at all. Noah folded the Cronin envelope and slid it into the back of a kitchen drawer. He did not tear it up. He did not throw it away. He put it where he would not have to look at it, but where it would remain a question he was not ready to answer. Later that night, when Amara was asleep in her room and the apartment was quiet again, he sat at the table and did not open the notebook. He did not open anything. He just sat there in the same chair where he had learned 9 languages and stared at the dark window and tried to figure out what he had left. Noah Monroe had spent his whole life being invisible. That morning, for 4 minutes, he had let the world see him, and the world's first response was to make him disappear again. Vivian Hart did not leave her office that night. The building had emptied hours ago. The cleaning crews had come and gone, different ones now, covering Noah Monroe's shift without knowing why it was open. Vivian sat behind her desk on the 49th floor with the conference room recording pulled up on her laptop, the overhead lights off the city glowing through the window she never looked at. She played the session from the beginning, every language, every exchange. She followed Noah's translations against the original audio, cross-referencing them with the contract drafts her legal team had prepared. She was not doing this out of sentiment. She was doing it because Vivian Hart did not make decisions based on feelings, and she was not about to start now. The numbers assembled themselves with cold clarity. The French ambiguity alone, if unchallenged, would have given Cronin conditional control over Hawthorne's European entry points. The Northern Spanish exclusion protocol would have barred them from 4 countries. The Milanese clawback provision could have cost them shared infrastructure worth tens of millions. The penalty clause hidden in the Arabic blessing, 12% of total contract value for any renegotiation within 36 months, would have made it financially impossible to change terms once the ink was dry. And the Romansh restriction, the one nobody in the room had caught except a man in rubber-soled shoes, would have locked Hawthorne out of independent Western European operations for 7 years. She ran the total. Conservative estimate compounded across lost revenue, forfeited contracts, and competitive disadvantage close to $100 million. One man had caught it. 14 experts had missed it. Vivian closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The numbers were enough to justify bringing Noah back. They were more than enough. But something else was working through her mind, and it was not a number. She kept returning to the moment he had walked through the side door. The blue uniform, the damp shoes, the cleaning bottle he had set on the floor before speaking. She thought about Gerald Foster's first reaction, not "what did he say," but "get him out." She thought about Diane Pratt's concern, not "was his translation accurate," but "what will the press think?" She thought about Ray Collins calling it a security violation before anyone had verified whether the violation had just saved the company. And then she asked herself a question that she already knew the answer to. If Noah Monroe had walked into that room in a tailored suit with a degree from an Ivy League school with lighter skin, would the leadership team have suspended him, or would they have called him a hero? The answer sat in her chest like a stone. The problem was not optics. The problem was not protocol. The problem was that Hawthorne Global had nearly destroyed itself because every person in that building, including her, had decided what a janitor was allowed to know before he ever opened his mouth. She had built her career on seeing what others missed, and she had looked at Noah Monroe every time he mopped the hallway outside her office at midnight and seen nothing at all. She picked up her phone and sent one message to the board coordinator emergency session, 8 a.m., full quorum. The boardroom filled at 7:55, 8 directors. Daniel Webb sat at the far end, his posture communicating what his face did not. Vivian did not open with an appeal. She opened with a spreadsheet. She projected the damage analysis onto the wall screen, every hidden clause, every mistranslated term, every financial exposure that Noah had identified and that 14 professional interpreters had missed. She walked through each line without raising her voice, delivering the data with the same precision she brought to every quarterly report. When she reached the bottom line, prevented losses nearing 9 figures, she let the number sit on the screen. Then she turned to the room. "We are here because the leadership team suspended the only person who heard what was happening in that negotiation. They suspended him within 20 minutes of a recess. Not because his translations were wrong, no one has challenged a single word he said. They suspended him because he is a janitor, and because he is black. And because the idea that someone like him could do what 14 credentialed experts could not was to them more threatening than the catastrophe we nearly signed our name to." Gerald Foster shifted in his seat. Diane Pratt stared at her tablet. Ray Collins looked at the table. Vivian continued. "I am asking this board to reinstate Noah Monroe immediately and to offer him a position as Global Diplomatic Strategy Advisor reporting directly to me." Daniel Webb stood. He had the kind of authority that came from 3 decades in boardrooms, and when he spoke, the room listened whether it wanted to or not. "Vivian, I have supported every major decision you have made in 8 years, but this is not a strategic decision. This is an emotional one. You are asking us to elevate a janitor with no credentials, no security clearance, and no track record to an executive advisory role because he happened to be in the right hallway at the right time. That is not leadership. That is a liability." Vivian looked at him. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the moment Daniel called her the night before. And she had already decided what it would cost her. "Daniel, let me ask you something. If that man had been your nephew, if he had walked in wearing a Brooks Brothers suit holding a Georgetown diploma speaking 9 languages, would you be calling this a liability, or would you be calling it the most impressive hire this company has ever made?" Daniel Webb did not answer. The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of a man confronted with something he had no rehearsed response for. The vote was called. 5-3 in favor of reinstatement. Daniel Webb voted against. He gathered his papers without looking at Vivian and left the boardroom before the session formally closed. He did not say goodbye. He did not promise to reconsider. 8 years of political alliance, the alliance that had kept her in her chair through a restructuring and expansion, and 2 attempts by the old guard to replace her ended in a single morning. Vivian watched him walk through the door and felt the weight of it settle somewhere behind her ribs. Not regret. She did not regret it. But a decision that costs nothing, changes nothing. And this one had cost her the most powerful friend she had in the building. That afternoon, a call came to Noah's apartment. The number belonged to Hawthorne Global's main line, a number he had only ever seen on his pay stubs. He listened to the offer in the kitchen, standing by the window, looking out at the same street he watched every night after studying. Global Diplomatic Strategy Advisor. Direct report to the CEO. A salary that would not require him to pick up overtime shifts to cover his daughter's dental insurance. He said yes. Then he hung up and stood there for a long time, his hand still on the phone. That evening, Victor Cronin received a one-line message from his deputy Monroe, is staying at Hawthorne. Victor read it in his hotel suite, set down his glass, and said to no one in particular, "Good." Then he called his lead negotiator. "Restructure the proposal, clean terms, no embedded clauses, no dialect strategy. If they have someone who can hear everything we negotiate as if everything can be heard." For the first time in the history of the Cronin Consortium's dealings with Hawthorne Global, both sides would sit at the same table, speaking the same language. Morning. Noah Monroe walked up to the front entrance of Hawthorne Global's headquarters, the glass doors on the main avenue that he had passed every night for 2 years, on his way to the service entrance around the back. He had never used them. They had never been for him. He wore a button-down shirt, no tie, no suit jacket. He carried a leather bag that held his notebook, the same cloth-covered notebook with Swiss-German conjugations and Cairo dialect phrases, and the handwriting of a man who had taught himself the world one language at a time. The lobby was bright and enormous. He had only ever seen it empty at 2 in the morning, pushing a mop cart across the marble. Now it was full people in suits, people with briefcases, people who had always belonged here without ever having to prove it. The receptionist looked at his new badge, then up at his face. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe." It was the first time anyone in this building had ever called him by his name. Vivian Hart announced the Hawthorne Unseen Talent Initiative that same week, a company-wide program to identify and develop employees whose abilities had gone unrecognized, beginning with the departments that the executive floors had never thought to look at maintenance security custodial mailroom. The program did not require a degree. It did not require a title. It required only that someone somewhere in the building had been paying attention. That night, Noah put Amara to bed in the same small room in the same apartment with the leaking ceiling. The new salary would change things eventually, but not yet. Tonight, everything was the same, except him. Amara looked up as he pulled the blanket to her chin. "Daddy, are you still a janitor?" Noah smiled the same smile he had given her in this same room, in this same dark, just days ago. "No, baby, but I'm still the person who keeps everything standing." She closed her eyes, satisfied. He walked back to the kitchen table. The suspension letter was gone, thrown away that morning. The Cronin envelope was still in the back of the kitchen drawer, where he had put it, unopened, unanswered. He did not take it out. He did not need to. The question it asked had already been answered the night he chose not to sell what he knew to the man who would have used it as a weapon. The notebook sat in the center of the table, patient and familiar, asking nothing of him except that he keep going. Noah sat down, opened the cloth cover, and turned past the Swiss-German conjugations, past the Arabic notes, past 9 languages worth of a life that no one had seen until he decided to stop being invisible. He found a blank page. And he began learning his 10th. Noah was invisible for years, not because he had nothing to offer, but because nobody ever stopped to look. And I wonder how many people out there right now are just like him. Maybe they are sitting in a break room or riding a late bus home or studying at a kitchen table after their kids fall asleep, carrying something extraordinary that the world has never bothered to notice. If this story made you think of someone like that, or if it made you think of yourself, leave a comment. Tell me about the talent no one sees. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be heard, and so do you.